of the West. Today we are joined by Jefferson Glass, a multiple award winner, writer of numerous nonfiction, actually excellent award-winning nonfiction at that, and just recently moving into the realms of fiction with First Light of Dawn, and we're going to discuss all of that here in a moment. Jefferson, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you.
So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I was born and raised in ranch country of southeastern Oregon, moved to Wyoming in the early 1980s and worked around the state various places and ended up in Buffalo, Wyoming, up near the Montana border. Retired from day jobs here about 6 years ago. And that left me a little more time, and I'd written the first two books while I was still working a day job, and I decided to, after finishing remodeling the house I moved into, I decided it was time to give a shot at doing a little fiction work.
Excellent. Yes, I was going to ask what the big jump from there is, because you have a overall history as a historian, and we'll certainly get into what you do for research for books coming up here. But what brought you from the realm of nonfiction into fiction?
Well, it was kind of funny. My wife and I here about 7 or 8 years ago, it kind of woke up in the middle of the night. There was a local incident happened. A fellow had died mysteriously, and we had kind of said, well, what if this happened? And what if that happened? So at 2 o'clock in the morning, we're sitting there having this in-depth conversation of the possibilities. We kind of wrote this little scenario in our minds of how this would make a cool murder mystery. And that had been kind of in the back of our minds both. And I kind of tried to get her to write it. She says, no, you're the storyteller, so you're going to have to write this when it happens. I got to kind of put on the back burner for quite some time. And COVID hit, and couldn't do much running around doing anything. So sat down and wrote the first book. And it's a series, actually. This is the first of 5 right now, maybe more in the long run. But I've got the first 3 written and working on book 4 right now, and have one more to do for my contract with Dusty Saddle.
Excellent. Yes. Well, I've only heard about the first 2 so far, so I'm looking forward to finding out what else is going to be going on with those.
Well, the story continues. It's just kind of what it is. These books take place starting in 1930 in Las Vegas, and it was a really unique time for that town. Las Vegas was a little railroad town out in the middle of the desert. They had good, clean water there. It was nice for the steam locomotives, and that's what attracted the railroad there. And but pretty much nothing going on. And the fall of 1929, the stock market crashed, and unemployment. They really didn't have any method of tracking what unemployment really was at the time. But unemployment was estimated to be between 40 and 45% nationwide, and some people estimated way higher than that. But at any rate, the government decided they were going to build Hoover Dam and hire 5,000 men to do as much of the labor manually as possible to get people to work. And they announced that, and 15,000 men, many with families, showed up in Las Vegas in hopes of getting one of those 5,000 jobs. So here was a little town of 4,500 people out in the middle of the desert, not much of anything going on there, and all of a sudden their population quadrupled overnight. There you go. At the time, Prohibition been in effect for 10 years at the time, and for Nevada, as we see it now, in Las Vegas especially as we see it now, gambling was illegal. Alcohol was illegal, prostitution was not. So there was the railroad had set out when they laid out the town. They set out a block kind of off the side of town called Block 16, and Block 16 was the only place that drinking or gambling or any of that was allowed, and consequently there was a number of houses of ill repute there also. And it's kind of fun to look at the city directory and whatnot through those years. And it said there'd be a soft drink saloon with a ladies' boarding house upstairs. That's what it would
Sounds
be
so
listed
refined.
in the city directory. So that was the acceptable terminology at the time. So it made a very perfect background. I always liked that Gatsby era kind of thing, and it gave the perfect backdrop for me to start building some murder mysteries.
Indeed. So tell me a little bit about exactly what got you into doing murder mysteries per se, because it's like you come from a pretty solidly Western, well, you history of Wyoming background on things. You had the one thing there. What drew you to doing mysteries?
Well, I've always been a fan of Tony Hillerman, and I've read every book that he wrote, and kind of almost consequentially, when I won my award in 2015 for the best first nonfiction book, and Ann Hillerman also won a Spur Award for the best first fiction book that year. And we met at the time, and I got to tell her how much I loved her dad and all that, because he had passed away a few years before that. And we got to be casual acquaintances at the time. And so then I started reading all of hers, of course, as they came out. And you can't live in Wyoming without reading C.J. Box and Craig Johnson's Longmire series. And when I moved to Buffalo, Craig Johnson was about 10 miles from town here. And I had met him before, but we became not necessarily friends, but definitely acquaintances. And he's a very nice man. And he's given me good candid advice about dealing with publishers, dealing with literary agents, and all these things that he had. I have no complaints of publishers or literary agents. Mine's all fell into place very nicely. So, but I've heard nightmare stories from others, and he says, "I'll share what I know about it." He's been very, very kind.
Indeed, and he's certainly gone down the whole road of all of this. He from everything from books to screen to everything else going on in between, and top of the charts for everything. So yeah, it's an excellent person to get advice from on all of that.
And he did a very nice endorsement on my first book for me. So
He did indeed, yes. Never hurts to have that.
right.
So what got you into Connor Armenta as a character?
In recent years, the woke thing has really got publishers on kind of standing on end, and I didn't want to get into a lot of homosexual. I've always I grew up not far from the Indian reservation, and I was used to mixed marriages and this type of thing. I thought, well, this was a nice way to approach that political agenda without going over the top. And I made it very believable. And if you, in studying some history of Las Vegas, there was a lot of Irish and there was a lot of Spanish people there. So it made the perfect opportunity to have a couple of sheep herder families. One was Irish, one was Spanish, which was common for both of those groups of people at the time, to have gotten married and thus had this family that Connor Armenta was the oldest child of. And so it just fit the story really well. And I like doing it that way. And it was very interesting to read some of these histories that the people that they interviewed that had been around during those very early years. There was no racism. There was no prejudice of any kind in Las Vegas before the railroad came. Before that, if you were Italian, it was Italian. If you were Irish, you were Irish. And if you were black, you were black. If you were Native American, you were Native. And nobody really cared as long as you did what you said you were going to do. And everyone based their opinions on honesty and integrity and how hard you worked. And that's what you were judged by, not anything else. Then when the railroad came, then they started a lot of outside influences, and things changed some. But it was kind of an interesting outlook people had.
Yeah, and Vegas, even when you jump up through history on things, always had some of the most interracial performers going on anywhere as a mecca for that going on, short of
Absolutely.
Harlem and such like that going down.
Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, you're kind of starting the roots of what would become.
Right. Yeah, and that's kind of what I wanted to do. I wanted to present that as an open door, and also it kind of casually mention it as a backstory on a couple of little places uh, uh, of prejudice coming from East Coast backgrounds or whatever the case may be. Growing up or lived elsewhere.
Yeah. And I assume if you keep the stories going long enough, you're going to deal with the huge influx of all kinds of changes coming to them here.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. At this point, I'm about a third of the way through book 4, and we're still at the tail end of 1930. So
You got some time.
yeah, publisher asked how we're going to how long this is going to run. And I go, well, there's a lot happened between 1930 and 1940, and I'm still in the first year. So there's a lot of
Wide
influence.
open spaces, yes.
So,
So tell me a little bit about how you go about forming up a novel. Where you come up with the idea? You had the overall news article that got you the inspiration for starting to write into this type of thing, but what really gets the idea for the individual book, and what do you do next?
well, it's kind of funny because I was asked recently about writer's block, and I said, well, I don't tend to have that very much. I get the idea for the book, and I do a kind of a rough outline, and not not structured outline like some do. Uh, and I know this is what I want the story to be, and I know I want it to go from here to here to here, and how that's going to all work out. And then I just start writing and see how it works. Greg Johnson told me a number of years ago, the first time I very first met him, actually, he says you have to have, if you're going to be a professional writer, you have to have a system. And he says my system is, he has a little ranch outside of town. He says I go out and he says I do my chores in the morning. I come in and I take a shower. While I'm taking the shower, do make some breakfast. He says after he does breakfast, it's about 9 o'clock or so. I go up to my study is upstairs in his house. I go up to my loft and uh, I walk in the door, I close the door, and I sit down. And says, I talk to my imaginary friends, and I write down what they say. and it's kind of become that way almost for me. I really like strong characters. I like maybe not strong personalities, but they're, even if they're timid, that's a strong character is a timid person. And I like to work out how these people would interact with each other under certain circumstances. And it's been really fun to work at it that way, and try to see Connor's girlfriend's point of view on things, and a lot of this is personal experiences, and how they go like, well, how would my wife react to this, and trying to go that way. There's a little bit of me and Connor in a minute, and there's a little bit of my wife in June Summers, his girlfriend, and as the story progressed, our basic kind of little thing that we had worked out years ago was book 1. And so when book 1 was over, I had introduced a couple of things that had come into play that were kind of backstories of different things that added into that, and kind of left a couple of loose ends on that, so that while I was researching, I came across a situation. I was researching on book 1 where UNLV has a lovely library of old newspapers philosophy, and I was researching this I don't remember what I was researching at the time, but I came across this news article, front page story of a young Indian kid that got hit by a train out north of town. He was obviously trying to get back to the Moapa Indian Reservation at the time. And there was this, those days, gruesome sold newspapers. I mean, the descriptions of this it was just, you didn't want to eat dinner right after you got done reading about it. Yeah. And but I read several newspapers over a few weeks, and then they had a hearing and of who was responsible, and of course the railroad wasn't responsible, and the kid's family was, just out, But anyway, I thought, well, what if the kid did get hit by a train, but got thrown from the train, or was murdered? This was a murder, not an accident, and so before I ever finished book one, I already had going in the back of my head what book two was going to be about, and it starts out with this kid getting hit by a train, and that becomes a major part of the story, and there was a couple of those loose ends from the first book turned out to be in the second book, and discovered because of this Indian kid getting hit by the train, how this other person had been kidnapped and eventually been killed, and another person, it wasn't a suicide, he was a murderer also, and brought the whole thing together. So that was okay. So book two is all said and done and fine, and I'd introduced another little story that I'd heard about some Nevada history and research into it. This part actually had happened up around Elko, Nevada, and but so I want to add this kind of into this somewhere along the line. That I just kind of gave some early hints at the tail end of the book of this coming forward, and but I really didn't have a main story. This was just a little sideline kind of wrestling thing, and so I go, and it was funny because when I finished the project, I have this great feeling of accomplishment. You wrote that last page, and I had finished it the one afternoon, and wife and I think went out to dinner that night, kind of celebrating a little bit, if I remember, and I had no concept of what the second book was really going to be about, and I literally woke up the next morning and in the shower taking a shower, and it was just recently before that can't remember the movie actor's name, but sure, a couple of years ago, or a year and a half ago, a movie actor accidentally killed another actor on set with a gun that was not supposed to be loaded, but it was. And I go, hey, 1930 talking movies were just becoming popular, and Las Vegas actually has a pretty good history of several of those old early westerns were filmed there. And I go, so we're going to have a shootout, and somebody ends up dead, and while filming a movie, and that became the main. That's why the title of the third book is Sons of the Texas Star, and that was the imaginary movie that they were filming. And so I at some point in time, I had the whole story of what the movie was in my head, and I says, at some point in time, I might actually write a traditional Western. It's going to be Sons of the Texas Star, the source or whatever. I don't know how I'm going to title that, but it's going to be the story behind that movie that they were filming in book three. It's interesting how you come across things. I decided on book four there was going to be a sniper hitman involved, and I said, well, this is the perfect time frame. There's a lot of World War I vets, about 10 years out of, a little over 10 years past, at the end of World War I, and so doing a little research, deciding let's find, well, what kind of rifle did the United States Army snipers use in World War I? So that kind of thing. And so I got studying a little bit of researching a little bit about snipers in World War I. And I discovered that a large percentage of the snipers in the United States Army in World War I were Native Americans, because they were extremely good at sneaking in and out of places from all of their, growing up as hunters and whatnot. They were very, very good at being quiet and stealthy at getting in and out of places. And the military latched onto that and made a lot of these guys snipers in World War I. So I said, okay, so not only are we going to have a sniper, but he's going to be a Native American sniper, and that's going to put Honor Armento on a wild goose chase trying to chase this guy down, because he really knows how to hide in the mountains. And this is a large portion of this story takes place on a range of mountains called the Mormon Mountains in very southern Nevada, a little bit north of Las Vegas, about 8 miles or thereabouts. And so I do a lot of studying the geography of what's going on. Not quite as accurate in book 1 as 2, 3, and 4. I've literally studied exactly where when they're going down, riding down a trail, and he says there's a spring there, there's a spring there, there's a cave there, there's a cave there, and it's I always admired that about Louis L'Amour's writing when I was reading all his books when I was younger, and he was very accurate. There's places that I physically knew about myself, and he had written a book that took place there. It was very accurate of where it was, and Zane Grey was the same way. So, that was my Western influence. Came from my grandfather was an avid Zane Grey reader, and he had passed away before I was born. And my grandmother had his Zane Grey collection. When I was a little kid, she would let me take one home when we visited, and when I brought it back, I could take another one. And I read most of the Zane Grey collection when I time I was into about 40 that way. And after I ran out of Zane Grey books, I started reading Louis L'Amour. And I read the rest of my 20s, kind of thing. But I've always loved the history and the accuracy of it. I wasn't a good history student in high school or that, but I love the hands-on. I love visiting historic places and finding out what happened there and why. And that's had a big influence on me. And it's a big part of writing my fiction too, because that's part of the reason I set this in 1930. As we're going to give you a little bit of a history lesson too, and maybe as Michael here, who's endorsed both the first and the second book, made fantastic endorsements on both. New York Times bestselling author, and a fairly good friend of mine, lives over in Cody, Wyoming, and he went and he said, "Well," he says, "You're almost becoming a travel log here. You don't."
Start offering tours after this. Yes.
You don't have to be narrating the trip down the road. So, which I've done a little bit of that as a host on bus tours for historic gatherings and conventions and whatnot in Wyoming.
So that's where the filler comes from.
Hey, can you come down here and we're going to do a bus tour to Fort Laramie? Can you talk for an hour and a half from Cheyenne to Fort Laramie about Fort Laramie so they know what to expect when they get here? So, well, I'm a pretty good BSer, so I guess I can do that. So,
very good. So what would be the best word of advice you could give to someone who's starting to try to learn to write more, particularly in the Western kind of field, Western mysteries, that type of thing? What one piece of advice could you give them?
I try to be as historically accurate as possible. Nobody wants to, I suspect that the majority of my readers are intelligent people, or they wouldn't be a reader. And they're going to know that a Schofield was invented in whatever year it was invented, or have a good idea. Don't have some guy 15 years before that shooting Schofield, and that's one of the things I try to do. I know from researching historically Butch Cassidy and a lot to do with Wilcox train robbery and that episode afterwards. Those guys liked 30-40 Craigs. They were high-powered rifle. They shot long distances, and they didn't go around carrying 30-30 Winchesters around like shown in every Western you ever saw in your life. They had bolt action 30-40 Craigs that could get out there and do some damage when it was far long ways away. They loved the what became the Colt 1911 automatic 45 automatic pistol, because at 10 rounds and you, all you had to do is pull the trigger and you're just gonna keep spitting bullets out of it. And these outlaw guys really like these latest and greatest in firearms, and so that's the kind of things that you want to be really in tune with when you're writing, as far as this, because notoriously traditional Western fiction is involved with rustlers and outlaws and gunfights and this kind of thing. You want to have the firearms and weapons be accurate for the time period that your story is taking place. When I was researching for my first nonfiction book, Reshaw, the revolver was just coming into play in the 1860s, early 1860s, and they're talking about it. It just astounded the Indians to see this gun that you didn't have to reload. You just kept pulling the trigger and it kept shooting, and they didn't really conceive that there was only 6 bullets. That just because the guy shot doesn't mean he's not going to shoot again. And it would really amaze them. And because Retail was a trader with these Indians, there was several instances where these revolvers were really amazed these Indians. And with repeating rifles and the other same thing too, and some of those guys were really good at it. Read the exploits of the Little Bighorn and find out some of those guys were really adept. Everybody says, well, all these Indian guys, they just pulled the trigger and pointed. And I says, no, some of these guys were really good shots. they knew what they were doing. They'd been around them for as many years as the white guys that were in the cavalry. They were funny. Indeed.
In the course of 20 years, you went from muzzle loaders all the way up to just about automatic weapons going on at that point.
Right.
A massive, well, Civil War had a lot to do with that, but yeah, it's massive amount of change going on there technologically on that.
And there was from the 1870s to the 1940s. We marvel at the computer age and what it's done in our lives. From dial telephones to cell phones that have more memory than my first computer had. And boy, what happened in those 70 years, turn of the 20th century. It was amazing. My Empire book takes place from 1864 to 1950. Was the man that book was basically around. That was his life. He came west in 1880 from New Jersey, and in 1880, the fastest thing in the world was a steam locomotive, and the fastest one of that was in France, and it ran something like 70 miles an hour with just a locomotive and a tender, no cars behind it. And I don't think there was any tracks in the United States that could handle one at that speed. But at the time, the Transcontinental Railroad averaged 20 miles an hour coast to coast. It took days to get from New York to San Francisco. And so that was the as I say, the speed of life when Martin Gosberg came west in 1880. That's how fast life was. You'd have a horse that could run 20 miles an hour in a short sprint. But if for a long distance, that was it. This fellow died in 1947. And a week before he died, Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier with the X1. He goes, that was his adult life in the West. All that technology had happened at that time. And it's something that I think you need to keep in your story as you write and in your mind as you're writing. Hey, your story, this is what's happening in your story. You got a really good plot and everything else, good characters. But what was going on that influenced all this too? You got to kind of keep that in mind as you're writing to make it fully believable. My wife hates it when I talk. I worked for a helicopter company for a number of years. I'm pretty good at identifying helicopters in the 70s and 80s anyway. And because they says, well, that's a this. Because nobody cares. Or they'll have a helicopter that hadn't been invented yet. This is with this 1970s. This is going on. It says, no, that helicopter didn't come out till the mid 80s. They need to have a little bit older one for that to make it accurate. And there are people that literally that's what they do. They spend time watching movies and spend more time watching for bloopers than they do story than the actual movies. But that would be fun on these, right? Is try to, if you're writing a story that takes place in a historic time, whether it's an actual, historic novel about someone in real life or it's imaginary fictitious, it still needs to be believable. And have semi trucks doing wheelies like in James Bond movie one year.
Yeah,
It can't be done. Even if James Bond can't do that. So
somebody found out they could do it, so they threw it in the movie. But yeah. So where can people learn more about Jefferson Glass author?
I have a website that is Jefferson Glass author.com, and there's things on there about me, and I on Facebook. I spend a fair amount of time on Facebook, and I don't know.
Those are all very good starts on that.
I try to have little mini bios. There's a little mini bio in the back of First Light of Dawn.
Excellent. So yeah, all of your books are available up on Amazon and able to get from there. And certainly Dusty Saddles has new ones coming out here. We got First Light of Dawn is currently at press, and we are waiting very happily on Shifting Sands coming out. So yeah, well,
it'll be out late this spring, as far as that's our plan. And boy, I've got nothing but good things to say about his editing on Don was great. He was really anxious to see Shifting Sand and get work on it. And so I'm really pleased. I'm very excited about what's going on and getting lovely response and getting some good reviews on Amazon and on Goodreads on First Light of Dawn already. And I hope it goes well. It's going well so far, and I hope it continues that way. So,
indeed, glad to have you on board with all of that. And thank you for taking the time to join us today.
No, thank you. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you.